The little girl said it so quietly that most people would have missed it, her voice barely rising above the hum of traffic and chatter outside the small grocery store. But the young billionaire heard every word as if it had been shouted straight into his heart. "I had no cake on my birthday," she said, clutching a thin plastic bag that held nothing more than a loaf of discounted bread and a packet of candles she couldn't afford to light. He stopped walking, the world slowing around him as if time itself had tripped over her sentence. And he turned to see her standing there in shoes 2 sizes too big, eyes too old for her small face, cheeks smudged with dirt and dignity mixed together in a way only poverty can teach a child. Her mother stood behind her, frozen in embarrassment, already apologizing with her eyes, already preparing to pull her daughter away before anyone could feel uncomfortable. But the billionaire didn't feel uncomfortable. He felt shattered, because this wasn't supposed to happen in a world where people like him existed. People with penthouses and private jets and more money than birthdays they could remember. He knelt slowly, ignoring the curious stares around him, bringing himself down to her level, and asked softly how old she had turned. 8, she replied, then quickly added, "It's okay. I made a wish anyway." That was the moment something inside him cracked wide open, because he had forgotten what wishing felt like, forgotten what it meant to hope when there was nothing to lean on except belief. He stood up, glanced at the mother who was now trembling with quiet fear, and said words that sounded simple but would soon echo through thousands of lives. No child should remember a birthday without cake. He didn't announce who he was. He didn't call cameras. He simply took the little girl's hand and walked back into the store, buying not just a cake but balloons, candles, decorations and gifts, filling carts until the cashier's eyes welled with tears. But that was only the beginning, because as they stepped back outside, the girl looked up at him and asked innocently, "Are you rich?" He paused, smiled sadly, and said, "Rich enough to help, but not rich enough to ignore this." That night he couldn't sleep. Her words replayed over and over, louder than any boardroom meeting, heavier than any business deal. He pulled up his laptop and began researching children in the city who lived like her, children whose birthdays passed unnoticed, whose wishes were whispered into empty rooms. And by morning a plan was forming, one that would shock his company, confuse his investors, and ultimately change everything. Because sometimes the smallest voice reveals the loudest truth. The birthday party happened the very next day, but not the kind people expect when they hear the word billionaire, because there were no luxury halls or golden chandeliers, just a small community center filled with laughter, balloons brushing against peeling, paint, and a cake so big it made the little girl gasp when she walked in holding her mother's hand. She froze at the doorway, convinced it wasn't real, convinced it would disappear if she blinked, until the billionaire knelt again and said, "This one is just for you." When she blew out the candles, she didn't wish for toys or money. She wished that her mom wouldn't cry at night anymore. That was the moment he turned away, because even billionaires need a second to breathe. But the real shock came weeks later, when news broke that the young billionaire had quietly launched a foundation dedicated entirely to children who had never celebrated a birthday, funding food programs, education grants, housing assistance, and something he called Dignity Days, where every child was seen, celebrated, and remembered. Reporters tried to paint him as a hero, but he refused interviews, issuing only one statement: "I didn't change the world. A little girl changed me." Employees inside his company were stunned when he redirected profits toward community investment, when bonuses were tied to volunteer hours, when success was no longer measured only in numbers, but in names and faces. The little girl? She still visits the center every month, helping younger kids blow out candles, telling them, "You matter." And the billionaire? He says he finally understands wealth, not as something you accumulate, but something you pass on, because the loudest legacy isn't built in skyscrapers, but in moments where someone feels seen for the first time. The day of the birthday celebration arrived quietly, without headlines or cameras. Yet it carried a weight that would echo far beyond the walls of the modest community center where it was held, because when the little girl stepped inside, holding her mother's trembling hand, she stopped as if the world had suddenly become too beautiful to move through. Her eyes widening at the sight of balloons floating like colorful dreams above her head, tables covered in bright cloths, gifts stacked higher than her shoulders, and at the center of it all, a cake so large and glowing with candles that she whispered, "Is this really mine?" as if claiming it might make it vanish. The young billionaire watched her from a distance, his chest tightening, realizing that for the first time in his life, he was witnessing what real abundance looked like. Not numbers on a screen, not shares or assets, but a child finally feeling seen. When she blew out the candles, the room erupted in applause. But what shattered him was the wish she shared afterward, spoken softly into the microphone she barely knew how to hold. "I wished that no kid ever feels forgotten on their birthday again." And in that moment, something irreversible happened inside him, because success suddenly felt hollow if it didn't reach moments like this. That night, while the city slept, he sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the skyline that once symbolized victory, and realized how many lights hid dark stories behind them. How many children would go to bed believing they didn't matter? How many birthdays passed like ordinary days because survival came before celebration? By morning, he had made a decision that shocked his own executive team, redirecting millions into a new foundation without naming it after himself, insisting it carry no face, no ego, only purpose, launching programs that ensured every child registered through schools and shelters would receive not just a cake, but a day where they were the center of the universe, where their name was spoken, their story heard, their dignity protected. News spread fast, not because of press releases, but because families felt it. Because a mother cried, holding a cake she never thought she could give. Because a child learned that kindness could come from a stranger who simply listened. The little girl became the heart of it all, visiting events, holding younger children's hands, telling them with a quiet strength beyond her years, "You're important," while the billionaire watched from the background, understanding now that the greatest return on investment was not profit, but impact. When reporters finally cornered him and asked why he did it, he answered with words that silenced rooms across the world. "Because one sentence broke me. I had no cake on my birthday, and I refuse to live in a world where I can hear that and do nothing." The story spread not because it was flashy, but because it was real, reminding millions that kindness doesn't require permission, only action, and that sometimes the smallest voice can awaken the biggest hearts. And if you're listening to this right now, remember this: someone out there needs what you can give, whether it's time, kindness, or simply attention. And stories like this exist to remind us of that truth. So if this story moved you, inspired you, or made you believe in humanity again, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because every subscription helps us share more stories that matter, more stories that heal, and more stories that prove compassion can still change the world.